Welcome to Dad's Revenge, where quiet men prove that patience is a strength. Each story here is about a father who is underestimated, disrespected, or betrayed by the very people who should be protecting him, and how that father finds his own way to mend things. Welcome to today's story. On the morning my daughter was set to marry the man I'd trusted with my company, my plant manager pulled me into the walk-in freezer and pressed his hand over my mouth. Through the steel door, I heard my daughter's fiance and our new legal consultant plotting to force my signature on an $85 million contract, then poison my toast wine before the reception ended. "Once he signs, we don't need him breathing," she said, and something in her voice cracked 40 years open. So I let the wedding proceed exactly as planned. What none of them knew was that I recognized that voice. My name is Hassan Rosario. I am 68 years old, and I built the largest family-owned barbecue sauce company in the state of Missouri from a single smoker behind my grandfather's house in Kansas City. 4 generations, one recipe guarded so closely that even our own distributors don't know the full list of what goes into the bottle. That morning, I was supposed to walk into my own reception hall, a proud father watch my daughter marry the man I had mentored for 3 years, and shake hands on an $85 million deal that would put Rosario sauce on every grocery shelf between here and the coast. Instead, I was folded into the dark of a walk-in freezer, my back against a rack of brisket, my mouth pressed shut by the calloused hand of a man who had driven me to church every Sunday for 31 years. Roger Travis was not a man who panicked. He had pulled bodies out of burning houses before he ever pulled a truck into my driveway. So when his hand clamped over my mouth and his voice dropped to a whisper sharp enough to cut, I did not fight him. I went still. Something in his eyes told me stillness was the only thing keeping me alive. "Mr. Hassan," he breathed close enough that I could feel the heat off his skin. "You need to see this. Don't say a word, not one." The freezer door was not fully latched. A blade of gray morning light cut across the concrete floor, and through that narrow gap, I could see the loading dock behind the reception hall. The same dock where, in 4 hours, 300 of Kansas City's finest would be lining up for pulled pork and my daughter's first dance. 2 figures stepped into that sliver of light. I recognized the tuxedo before I recognized the man wearing it. Miles Carrillo. 34 years old, sharp as a new blade, the outside counsel I had personally chosen to close the biggest distribution deal of my life. And in 6 hours, the man who would marry my only daughter. He looked immaculate. He also looked like he hadn't slept. Beside him stood the woman I knew as Margaret Santana. 63, silver-haired, dressed for negotiation even at 7 in the morning, carrying the same leather portfolio she had carried into every meeting for the past 6 months. She had walked into my boardroom as the sharpest deal consultant Miles had ever worked with. She had walked out of every meeting since with more access to my company than anyone outside my own blood. Neither of them spoke like people preparing for a wedding. Margaret reached into her portfolio and drew out a small metal case no bigger than a deck of playing cards. She set it on the loading dock railing between them, and even from 30 feet away, through a 2-inch gap in a steel door, I could see her hand was perfectly steady. That kind of steady only comes from practice. "Are you sure about the dosage?" Miles asked. His voice cracked on the last word, the way a man's voice cracks when he already knows the answer and hates it. Margaret didn't answer right away. She looked at him the way I imagine a surgeon looks at a nervous intern patient, a little disappointed, entirely in control. "I have done this before," she said. Quiet, almost gentle. "You just need to make sure he signs before the toast." I felt the cold of that freezer settle somewhere much deeper than my skin. Roger's grip on my arm tightened. He had heard it too. 20 years of driving me to board meetings, to hospitals, to my late wife's funeral, and I had never once felt him shake. He was shaking now. Through the gap, Miles opened his jacket and slid the small metal case inside, close to his heart, the way a man hides something he is ashamed of and desperate for at the same time. "The signature page is tabbed," he said, "right after the toast. He won't even read it." "He never does," Margaret said. And there, right there in the shape of those 3 words, something happened to her voice that I have spent every day since trying to unhear. It wasn't cruelty, it was familiarity. The kind of familiarity that takes decades to build or one blood tie to inherit. My hand was still closed around the wooden spoon I had carried out of the kitchen that morning. The one my grandfather carved with his own initials. The one I touch before I taste any sauce that carries the Rosario name. I had not realized I was still holding it until my knuckles began to ache. "Once he signs, we don't need him breathing," Margaret said next, and the words landed exactly the way Roger had promised they would, like the freezer door had swung shut on my whole life and locked it from the outside. I did not gasp. I did not move. 40 years of boardrooms had taught me that the moment you show a predator you are afraid, you have already lost. But something else happened, something Roger could not have warned me about, because he did not know what I knew. It was not the plot that froze the blood in my chest. It was the voice. I had heard that exact cadence, that particular way of dropping the last word of a sentence, like she did not need anyone's permission to finish it, every single day for the first 6 years of my daughter's life. Roger felt me go rigid beneath his hand and mistook it for fear. He leaned in, his whisper barely a breath. "Sir, stay with me. We're going to get through this." I wanted to tell him it was not fear holding me together in that freezer. It was recognition. I did not let it show. I could not. 20 years in the sauce business does not train a man to hide from wolves, but 40 years in negotiations does, and every muscle in my body remembered its training, even as my mind screamed at me to move, to breathe, to run. Margaret set the metal case back into her portfolio and reached for a slim folder instead. The kind of folder I recognized instantly because I had signed the first page of it myself 3 weeks earlier in my own boardroom. Blue cover, Rosario Family Sauce Company letterhead. The $85 million distribution contract that was supposed to carry my grandfather's recipe into every grocery store between Kansas City and the coast. "The second signature page is tabbed in red," she said, tapping the folder once with a manicured nail. "Right after the officiant closes the ceremony during the toast, he'll be holding a pen in one hand and a champagne flute in the other. Men don't read contracts when they're being photographed smiling at their daughters. And the transfer clause activates the moment he signs," Miles said. Not a question. He was reciting something he had memorized the way a man recites a confession he has rehearsed so many times it no longer feels like a sin. "The moment both signatures are notarized," Margaret corrected. "Yours from 3 weeks ago, his this afternoon." The clause reads as a standard majority control provision tied to distribution milestones. Nobody on his legal team will flag it before the ink dries. By the time anyone reads it closely, Hassan Rosario will own 11% of a company that bears his own name. 11%. I have built boardrooms out of worse numbers than that. I have survived hostile buyouts, supplier betrayals, a recession that swallowed half the barbecue joints in Kansas City whole. I had spent 4 decades learning to read a bad deal from across a room, learning to hear the particular silence a person leaves right before they ask for something they know they shouldn't. But I had never once imagined the walls closing in from inside my own family's celebration, built brick by brick out of a contract I had proudly signed with my own hand in a room full of people who called me friend. "And if he doesn't drink the toast?" Miles asked. His voice had dropped low enough that I had to lean into the gap in the door, my cheek nearly against the cold steel. "Then we wait for the reception dinner," Margaret said, unbothered. "There will be wine with the meal. There is always wine with the meal. A man like Hassan does not celebrate his daughter's wedding sober." She said my name the way you say a word you have practiced saying casually over and over until the ease of it stops betraying how much it used to hurt. I felt Roger's hand tighten again on my arm, a silent warning, and I realized my own breathing had changed. Shallow, fast. I forced it slow. I forced my thoughts back onto the mechanics of what I was hearing, because the mechanics were something I could hold on to, something I could fight. And the other thing, the thing underneath her voice, was not. "Once he's gone," Miles said, and here his voice cracked in a different way than before, softer, almost reluctant. "What happens to Kaylani?" For the first time since they had stepped into that sliver of light, Margaret hesitated. "She keeps her shares," she said finally. "She keeps the house. She keeps everything she believes she earned." A pause longer than the first. "She deserves to know the truth someday, just not today." I did not understand what that meant. Not then. I only understood that a woman planning to poison me had just spoken about my daughter with something that was not calculation. Something that sounded impossibly, dangerously like grief. Miles didn't ask what she meant. Maybe he already knew. Maybe he simply didn't care enough to ask, the way a drowning man doesn't stop to admire the shape of the water pulling him under. "We should go," Margaret said, closing the folder. "The florist will be setting up the arch in 20 minutes, and I want eyes on the champagne delivery before the caterers touch it." Their footsteps crossed the loading dock and faded around the corner of the building, and the morning went quiet, except for the low hum of a refrigeration compressor somewhere above my head, and the sound of my own pulse, which I could hear now, loud and even and completely terrifyingly calm. Somewhere beneath that calm, a smaller, older question was trying to surface. Something about the shape of her sentences, the particular grief in the word someday. I did not let it rise. I pushed it back down where I keep the things I cannot afford to feel during a negotiation, and I promised myself I would return for it later when the freezer door was no longer the only thing standing between my family and a funeral. Roger released my mouth slowly, one finger at a time, as though he expected me to scream the moment he let go. I did not scream. I stood in the dark of that freezer, surrounded by the meat I had cured with my own hands for 30 years. And I understood with total clarity that the extravagant wedding I had spent $400,000 building was not a celebration at all. It was a trap, built out of love paid for by the very man it was designed to kill. Roger walked me to the reception hall in silence, both of us wearing the same careful, ordinary faces we would need to wear for the rest of the morning. We were at war, and my daughter was walking straight toward a woman with a secret older than her marriage. Roger pushed the freezer door open onto a morning that looked exactly the way it had 2 hours before I climbed inside Sunlight catering trucks, the smell of hickory smoke drifting over from the smoker pit where my pitmasters were already tending 300 pounds of pork shoulder. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. I stood on the loading dock and let my eyes adjust, and in that adjustment I made the first decision of the rest of my life. I was not going to stop this wedding. Roger stared at me like I had lost my mind, and for a moment, standing there in the loading dock sunlight with the smell of hickory smoke drifting toward us, I wondered if he was right. "Sir," he said low and urgent, "we call the police. We call them right now, and we get you and Miss Kaylani off this property before anybody puts a ring on her finger." "If I stop this today," I said, "with nothing in my hand but a conversation you and I overheard through a crack in a freezer door, my daughter will never speak to me again." I kept my voice level, the way I had kept it level in 100 boardrooms because a shaking voice invites questions I was not ready to answer. "She will believe I invented it. She will believe I have always hated the men who love her because some part of her has believed that since the day her mother left. Miles will comfort her through my supposed cruelty, and Margaret will disappear before sundown with every ounce of proof walking out the door in her portfolio." Roger's jaw worked, but he didn't argue. 20 years driving me to hospitals and funerals had taught him when my mind was closing around a decision like a fist. I thought of the silver bracelet on Kaylani's wrist, the one I had clasped there myself the morning she turned 18, engraved with the first 4 ingredients of our family's original sauce recipe. I had told her that day that a rosario keeps her promises, even when nobody is watching. I intended to keep that promise now, even though what I was about to do would look to anyone watching like the opposite of protection. "Lock down the security footage," I told Roger. "Every camera on this property starting now, not deleted, not touched, just quietly copied and moved somewhere Margaret Santana will never think to look. And if she checks the system, she'll see everything running exactly the way it always has." I straightened my jacket, the same jacket I would be wearing in 4 hours when I walked my daughter down an aisle built by the man planning to bury me under it. Nobody sounds an alarm today, Roger. Not you, not me. We let them believe they have already won. He didn't like it. I could see the argument still sitting behind his teeth. The same argument any decent man would make, that a father does not gamble his own life to preserve his daughter's wedding day. But Roger had also spent 3 decades learning that some fires you cannot put out with water. Some you have to let burn exactly where they are until you can see the whole shape of what's catching. He had told me once years ago about a house fire he'd walked into as a young firefighter. How the worst thing you could do was flood a room before you understood which wall the fire was actually behind. I could see him running that same calculation now, deciding which wall of my life he was willing to let burn a little longer. 1 hour, he said finally. Give me 1 hour to get eyes on everything, and then we talk about what comes next. I agreed, and we walked back toward the reception hall together. 2 men who had just watched a murder plotted in whispers, now walking into a garden full of white roses and string quartet warm-ups, as though nothing in the world had shifted beneath our feet. I found Miles near the groom's tent, adjusting his cufflinks in front of a gilded mirror somebody had wheeled in for the occasion. He looked radiant. He looked, I will admit even now, like a man genuinely happy to be marrying my daughter. And that was the cruelest part of the entire morning. Watching a face I had trusted for 3 years perform an emotion I could no longer tell was real or rehearsed. "Hassan," he said, turning with a bright, easy smile. "You made it. I was starting to think you'd gotten cold feet on my behalf." I crossed the distance between us and took his outstretched hand in both of mine, the way I greet the men I respect most in this world, the way my own father taught me a handshake should feel. Unhurried, both hands, eyes level. His grip was warm, steady, not the grip of a man who had 20 minutes earlier slid a case of poison into his jacket pocket. "Miles," I said, and I let every ounce of the pride I once genuinely felt for him rise into my voice, because that pride was not entirely a lie. It was simply aimed now at the wrong purpose. "I know exactly what you're about to do today, son." He laughed warm and unguarded and clapped my shoulder like we were sharing an old joke. "I hope so. I've had the vows memorized for a week." He had no idea what I meant. I did not correct him. I smiled and released his hand and walked toward the garden, where my daughter was somewhere getting ready to wear white for a man who had already decided how she would spend the rest of her life without me in it. What I did not know that morning in the garden, walking toward my daughter with a killer's handshake still warm on my palm, was that Miles Carrillo had needed saving once before. I would not learn the shape of it until days later, when a private investigator named Hayes Cole laid a folder on my desk and let the paper do what no conversation ever could. But the story belongs here at the beginning, because everything that happened in that freezer had already happened once before, quietly in a much smaller room. 10 months before my daughter's wedding, Miles sat alone in his law office at 11 o'clock at night, staring at a spreadsheet that would end his career. 2 years earlier, desperate to cover a bad real estate investment his own father had talked him into, Miles had moved $400,000 out of a client trust account and into a stock position that was supposed to recover the loss before anyone noticed. The stock did not recover. The client, an elderly widow from Overland Park who trusted Miles because he had handled her late husband's estate with genuine tenderness, had recently requested a full accounting of her funds ahead of a move into assisted living. Miles had bought himself 14 months of delays and excuses. He had run out of both. He told me all of this later, in pieces, in the wreckage of what came after, sitting across from me in a room neither of us wanted to be in. His voice flat, with an exhaustion that went deeper than sleep could fix. I believed him when he said the theft had started as a mistake he intended to fix, not a plan he intended to keep. That did not make it less of a crime. It only made him, in my eyes, something more complicated than a monster. A man who had made one unforgivable choice and then spent 2 years building an entire life on top of it. The way a person builds a house over a crack in the foundation and prays the ground holds. That night, staring at numbers that would not balance no matter how many times he ran them, his phone rang from a number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Carrillo?" said a woman's voice, calm and unhurried. The kind of voice that has already decided how a conversation will end before it begins. "My name is Margaret Santana. I understand you're facing a rather delicate accounting problem." Miles told me later that his first instinct was fear that someone from the Bar Association had already found him out, that this was the call ending everything. But Margaret didn't threaten him. She asked instead whether he had ever considered that some debts were simply the wrong size for the person carrying them and the right size for someone else entirely. They met 2 days later at a coffee shop in the Country Club Plaza, and Margaret arrived already knowing more about him than his own mother did. She knew about the widow in Overland Park. She knew about his father's failed lumber yard and the eviction notice that had followed Miles through 3 childhood addresses. She knew with unsettling precision exactly how much money would make his particular problem disappear, and exactly how little that amount would mean to a family like mine. "I have a client," she told him, stirring sugar into coffee she never drank, "who is about to become the outside counsel of record for the largest distribution deal Rosario Family Sauce has ever signed. $85 million, structured properly, moving through the right accounts." She let that number sit in the air between them, the way a hunter lets silence settle over a clearing. "A man like Hassan Rosario has more money than he will spend in 3 lifetimes. He has never once in 40 years missed a payment on anything. A small fraction of what passes through that contract would not even register as a loss to him. To you, it would mean never lying awake at midnight again." Miles told me he said no. He told me he meant it at first, with his whole chest, the way a man means something in the first 5 minutes after hearing it, before the weight of his own circumstances has had time to settle back down over him. But he did not hang up the phone. He sat in that coffee shop and let Margaret Santana explain in patient, reasonable detail precisely how such an arrangement might work, how a man could stay a good man in every visible way, marry well, build a real career, and simply make one invisible adjustment to a contract that a family with more money than sense would never even notice. "Nobody gets hurt," she said. And I have thought about that phrase more times than I can count in the months since, because it was the first lie in a chain of lies that would eventually end with a vial in a wedding planner's portfolio. Miles walked home that night past the block where his father's lumber yard used to stand, now a parking lot for a chain drugstore. And he told himself the same story he had been telling himself since he was 9 years old and watched movers carry his family's furniture out onto the curb. Everyone survives however they can. Nobody who has never been poor gets to judge the choices of a man who has. It was not forgiveness, it was armor, and he wore it well enough to believe for one more night that refusing Margaret Santana had cost him nothing. He did not answer her that day. He went home and did not sleep and told himself he had already refused. But 3 weeks later, he called Margaret Santana back. 2 weeks after that phone call, I hosted the 18th annual Rosario Family Sauce Leadership Dinner in the same reception hall where 10 months later, a man would plan my death over rented china. I did not know any of that yet. I only knew that Margaret Santana had recommended a sharp young attorney to handle our expanding distribution contracts, and that my daughter, against every instinct I had, spent her whole life building in her was about to fall in love with him across a room full of barbecue executives. Kaylani ran marketing for the company by then, had for 3 years, and she moved through that dinner the way she moved through everything, sure of herself, quick with a joke, impossible not to watch. I was standing near the bar when I saw Miles Carrillo cross the room toward her, and I remember thinking, with the particular pride of a father who believes he has taught his daughter to see through flattery, that she would eat him alive within 30 seconds and move on to the next conversation. She did not move on. I remember setting down my own drink to watch a little longer the particular attention of a father who has spent 30 years reading A Room for Danger and cannot quite switch that instinct off even at his own company dinner. I watched them talk for the better part of an hour, and even from across the room, I could see something in my daughter's posture change. The way she leaned in slightly when he spoke. The way she laughed at something and then caught herself laughing too easily. The way a person catches themselves feeling more than they intended to feel in front of a stranger. Miles told me much later, in the wreckage, that he had walked into that dinner already carrying Margaret's plan folded up somewhere in the back of his mind, and that meeting Kehlani had felt, for one terrible and honest moment, like the floor dropping out from under a lie he had already agreed to tell. She asked me what my favorite thing about contract law was, he told me once, months afterward, his voice hollow with a kind of grief I did not expect a guilty man to be capable of. Nobody had ever asked me that before. Not my father, not my ex-wife, nobody. And I told her the truth, that I liked the moment a deal finally balanced when every clause protected somebody who couldn't protect themselves. And she looked at me like that mattered, like I mattered. He asked her to dinner 3 days later. She said yes before he finished the question and told me about it the next morning over coffee with the particular breathless excitement she used to have as a girl describing a new friend she'd made at school before she'd even learned that friend's middle name. I will not pretend I understood in those early weeks what was happening beneath the surface of my daughter's new romance. I saw a talented young lawyer courting her with old-fashioned patience flowers on her desk on a Tuesday for no occasion at all, a handwritten note tucked into a contract he had reviewed for her. The kind of attention that made even a suspicious father start to lower his guard. I did not see a man at war with himself every single night, torn between a woman he was falling for and a debt he had already agreed to pay off using her father's blood. Miles told me that the guilt did not arrive all at once. It arrived in small doses at inconvenient times, watching Kehlani laugh at something he said and thinking simultaneously of the folder Margaret had shown him with the contract's tabbed signature page. Standing in my boardroom, shaking my hand and feeling the warmth of my trust land on him like an accusation he had not yet earned the right to deserve. 3 weeks into dating my daughter, he called Margaret and told her he wanted out. She did not raise her voice. She never did. She simply reminded him in that same unhurried tone she had used on their very first call that the widow in Overland Park had recently hired her own forensic accountant and that certain discrepancies in certain trust accounts tended to surface within 18 months if nobody intervened to smooth them over first. She reminded him that intervening in this particular case required exactly the kind of money that only one contract in his entire professional life could provide. "You can love her and still finish this," Margaret told him. "The two things are not in conflict. You are simply protecting your future together the only way available to a man in your position." Miles believed her, or told himself he did, because believing her was easier than believing what he had actually become. I found out months later that on the night Kehlani agreed to be exclusive with him, Miles drove home alone at 2 in the morning and sat in his car outside his apartment for nearly an hour, engine off, hands still on the wheel. He did not cry. He told me that much with something close to shame, as though even his guilt had failed to reach the size of what he'd done. He simply sat there in the dark, replaying the sound of her laugh, and made himself a promise he had absolutely no intention of being able to keep. "Don't let this become real," he told himself, watching her name light up his phone with a message wishing him good night. It was already real. It had been real since the moment she asked him what he loved about his work, and he answered her honestly for the first time in longer than he could remember. He just wasn't ready yet to let that truth cost him anything. By the time 3 months had passed, Miles had stopped fighting whatever war he was losing inside himself, at least where I could see it. He had proposed to my daughter on a Tuesday in April, down on one knee in the test kitchen where my father used to develop new pepper blends, and I remember thinking, watching Kehlani cry with joy into his shoulder, that I had never seen a man look so genuinely terrified of deserving something. I did not understand that terror then. I understand it now, the way you only understand certain expressions on a man's face once you have already learned what he was hiding behind them. The venue conversation happened on a Sunday evening in June over a dinner I hosted every week at my house in Brookside, the same house where Kehlani grew up eating my mother's cornbread recipe at that same oak table. We had already signed a deposit on the Kessler Ballroom downtown, a beautiful old building with marble floors and a view of the Country Club Plaza fountains, and I had always pictured walking my daughter down its grand staircase. "I want to talk about the venue," Miles said, setting down his fork with the careful precision of a man who has rehearsed a pitch. "Hassan, I've been thinking about the timing of the wedding and the distribution signing, and I think we're making a mistake putting both events in a downtown ballroom." I frowned, setting down my own glass of sweet tea. "The Kessler has hosted royalty. What's wrong with it?" "Nothing's wrong with the room." He leaned forward, folding his hands the way he folded them in every negotiation I had ever watched him win. "But we're not just hosting a wedding that day, Hassan. We're hosting the signing of an $85 million distribution deal in front of trade journalists, in front of competitors who would very much like a photograph of exactly which vendors and formulation partners show up to celebrate with you. A downtown ballroom has valet stands, press credentials, 300 strangers with camera phones. Anyone could walk that lobby and photograph a signature page over someone's shoulder." Kaylani reached for his hand across the table, already nodding. She had grown up watching me guard the family recipe like a second religion, refusing to let even trusted employees see the full ingredient list at once. Miles knew exactly which fear to pull on, and he pulled it with the tenderness of a man who genuinely believed he was protecting us. "The processing plant has a private security perimeter already," Miles continued. "Fencing cameras a single access road we control completely. We could host the ceremony in the garden behind the loading docks, the reception in the finishing warehouse. It's beautiful once it's decorated, Hassan, I promise you. And we control every single person who walks onto that property. No press, no competitors, no risk to the formula, the contract, or your family's privacy on the two biggest days of your professional life happening at once." I sat with that for a long moment, turning my fork over in my hand, weighing the sound sense of what he was saying against a faint discomfort I could not yet name and did not that evening think worth examining any further. "You've clearly thought this through," I said, and meant it as the compliment it sounded like. "I love your daughter," Miles said, and I believed him completely because it was in that single sentence the truest thing he had said to me in 3 years. "I'm not going to let anything jeopardize her happiness or your company on the same afternoon." Kaylani squeezed his hand and looked at me with the particular hopeful expression she had worn since she was 6 years old, asking permission for something she had already decided to want badly enough that my answer barely mattered. I had spent her entire life trying to give her the normal moments my success had made impossible: birthday parties without security details, a graduation nobody photographed for the business page. Here was a chance Miles was arguing to give her a wedding that belonged only to us. I reached for the wooden spoon resting beside my plate, the one I carry to every family dinner out of a habit older than Kaylani herself, and I ran my thumb over my grandfather's carved initials, the way I do when I'm deciding something that matters. My hand paused there just slightly, some old and wordless part of me hesitating over a decision the rest of me had already made. I have thought about that small, wordless pause more than almost anything else from those months. Turned it over in my mind the way I once turned over the spoon itself. I did not know then what I was hesitating against. I only felt it the way you feel weather change before the sky confirms it. "Draw up the amendment," I said finally. "We'll move the ceremony to the plan." Kaylani was out of her chair before I finished the sentence, coming around the table to wrap both arms around my neck, her cheek pressed against mine the way it had been when she was small enough to carry. "Thank you, Daddy," she whispered, and I felt her whole body relax against me. Weeks of quiet wedding planning stress finally releasing at once. "You have no idea what this means to me." I held my daughter and looked over her shoulder at Miles, who was smiling at both of us with an expression I had until that freezer never once had reason to doubt. I had no idea either what it would come to mean. 2 weeks after the venue change, I mentioned to Miles, mostly in passing, that my left hand had developed a small tremor when I held a pen too long. It was nothing. 68 years old and 40 years of stress had earned me the right to a shaking hand now and then, and Fernando Frank, my physician of 25 years, had already told me as much during my spring physical. Fernando was the kind of doctor who asked how many hours you'd slept before he asked anything else, who had sat with me in a hospital waiting room the night my wife's heart finally gave out, who knew my body better than I knew it myself. He had a habit of calling me on Sunday evenings, not for any medical reason, just to ask how the week had treated me, and I had never once thought to question why a busy man would spend his own free time checking on an old friend. Miles listened to me mention the tremor with an expression of concern so immediate and so tender that I did not at the time think to question it. "Have you had it looked at by someone who specializes in this?" he asked that evening over coffee in my study. Not to say anything against Dr. Frank, but he's been doing general practice for, 3 decades? Preventative cardiology has changed enormously in the last 5 years alone. There's a concierge physician I've heard incredible things about, Dr. Mohammed Combs. He works exclusively with executives your age, does full biomarker panels, catches things standard checkups miss entirely. I told him I would think about it, and I meant it the way a man means most promises he has no intention of keeping quickly. But Kaylani had overheard the conversation from the doorway, and by the following week she had already scheduled the appointment herself, her voice tight with a worry I had not seen in her since her mother's diagnosis. "Daddy, please," she said, "just one visit, for me." I have never once in my life been able to refuse my daughter that particular sentence. Not when she was 6 and asking to stay up late, not now, not at any point in between. Dr. Mohammed Combs arrived at my office on a Thursday morning wearing a white coat over a suit clearly tailored for someone with more money than most physicians make, and he spent 40 minutes running through a list of questions that felt less like medicine and more like a sales pitch dressed up in Latin terminology. He talked about cellular inflammation, about biomarker optimization, about a proprietary supplement protocol he had developed specifically for what he called high-performance executives entering their 7th decade. He had a way of nodding slowly after every answer I gave him, as though each ordinary detail of my life confirmed some private diagnosis he had already reached before he ever walked through my door. He never once picked up a stethoscope. "Your tremor is almost certainly related to mild cardiovascular strain," he told me, sliding a heavy glass bottle across my desk. Amber glass protects the compound from light degradation. 2 capsules every morning with coffee consistently. The formula only works if it's allowed to build steadily in your system. Give it 6 weeks. I promise you'll feel the difference before your daughter's wedding. I asked him out of habit more than suspicion what exactly was in the capsules. He gave me an answer full enough of proprietary blend and clinically studied compound that it told me nothing at all. And I let it go because I trusted the man who had recommended him, and because my daughter was sitting in the chair beside mine, watching me with an expression that made refusing feel like a cruelty I did not have the strength for. I thought once about calling Fernando first, just to ask his opinion of Dr. Combs's protocol. I even picked up the phone one evening and let it sit heavy in my hand for the better part of a minute before setting it back down, telling myself I did not want to insult a man I respected by asking him to weigh in on his own quiet replacement. I never called Fernando Frank to tell him about the new arrangement at all. I told myself I would eventually, once the wedding chaos settled down. Some part of me, I think now, already sensed there would not be time. The next morning, I stood at my kitchen counter with my coffee and the heavy amber bottle Dr. Combs had left behind. And Kaylani wandered in wearing the old Rosario family sauce t-shirt she'd slept in since college. Her hair still tangled from sleep, and she watched me twist the cap open with something close to relief written across her whole face. "You're really taking them," she said. "I was worried you'd just leave the bottle sitting there out of stubbornness." "When have I ever been stubborn?" I said, and she laughed the laugh she'd had since she was small, bright and unguarded. And I swallowed the first 2 capsules dry, chasing them with black coffee the way the good doctor had instructed. I did not feel anything at all that first week. Not that morning, not the next. That I would later learn was precisely the point a compound engineered to build silently, invisibly for weeks, waiting patiently for a trigger no ordinary blood panel would ever think to look for. I only remember that Kaylani smiled at me over her own coffee mug, genuinely happy, genuinely relieved, watching her father take care of himself for once, instead of the company. I was swallowing my own slow execution, and my daughter was smiling as she watched. 1 month before the wedding, Margaret Santana walked into the Rosario Family Sauce boardroom, carrying a contract thick enough to stop a door, and I remember thinking, watching her set it down on the mahogany table with both hands, like something ceremonial that I had never seen a woman treat paperwork with quite so much reverence. $85 million, she said, sliding the folder toward me. National distribution across every major grocery chain west of the Mississippi, with an option to expand east in year 3. I've negotiated protections into every clause that touches your formula, your branding, your family's control of the company. This is without exaggeration the best contract I have structured in 15 years of doing this work. I had by that point learned to trust Margaret's instincts almost without reservation over the 6 months she had consulted for us. She caught details my own legal team missed, negotiated concessions from partners who rarely gave an inch, and she had never once in all that time given me reason to look past the confidence in her voice to whatever sat underneath it. I had started, without quite noticing, to defer to her the way I once deferred only to men who had earned it over decades. Stanley Portillo sat at the far end of the table, my general counsel of 11 years. A man who trusted spreadsheets more than smiles, and had never once, in a decade, let a contract cross my desk without reading every appendix twice, start to finish. He had the folder open to page 43, his mechanical pencil tapping a slow, deliberate rhythm against the paper. A habit I had learned over the years meant he was building toward an objection he intended to make carefully. "Margaret," he said, not looking up, "walk me through Section 12. The majority control provision tied to distribution milestones." "Standard language," Margaret said smoothly, without missing a beat. "It protects the distributor's investment in the event the company underperforms projected volume in the first 18 months. Boilerplate. You'll find nearly identical language in any deal of this size." "I've reviewed a dozen deals this size," Stanley said, his pencil finally going still. "I don't recognize this particular structure. The trigger language here reads less like a performance safeguard and more like—" "Stanley," Miles cut in warm and easy, the way he cut into every tense moment in that boardroom, with the practiced grace of a man born to smooth things over. "I reviewed that section myself, line by line, before it ever reached Hassan's desk. It's tied to notarization timing on both signature parties, which is unusual, I'll grant you, but it's how their legal team structures every deal this size. I promise you, if there were anything predatory buried in there, I would have flagged it before I let it anywhere near my future father-in-law's signature." I watched Stanley's face for a moment, the particular stillness of a man deciding whether to push further against two people who both in their own ways had earned my trust more thoroughly than he had in 11 quiet years of never once being wrong. I have thought about it many times since, how strange a thing trust is, that a man could be right for 11 straight years and still lose an argument to two people who had only been right for 6 months and 3 years respectively, simply because their rightness had come wrapped in more warmth. In the end, after weighing 11 years of quiet competence against 6 months and 3 years of considerably more charm, I chose Miles. "Draft a summary memo on Section 12, I told Stanley, "and I'll have my personal counsel review it independently before we execute. But I don't want to hold up a deal this size over boilerplate language that Miles has already vetted." Stanley nodded once, the way a man nods when he has said everything he is willing to say without being asked twice, and made a note on his legal pad that I did not think to ask about again for 2 months. I have that legal pad still, sitting in a drawer of my desk, 3 words underlined twice beneath his signature: confirm signatory timing. Margaret opened the signature section and turned the folder toward me, tabbing the first page with a manicured fingernail. "We'll structure it as a 2-stage execution," she explained. "Your signature today as the seller of record, the distributor's signature at the reception. It photographs beautifully, honestly, and their executive team has specifically requested the symbolism of closing the deal on your daughter's wedding day. Their CEO, Harrison Faulkner, will be attending personally, water glass in hand as always to sign the second page during the toast. It sounded at the time like exactly the kind of sentimental gesture a proud father wants to hear. A deal 40 years in the making closed on the happiest day of his daughter's life, witnessed by everyone who mattered to him, folded neatly into the same afternoon as her walk down the aisle. I picked up my pen, the same fountain pen my own father had used to sign the papers incorporating this company in 1981, and I signed my name across the first page without reading past section 11. Margaret smiled, closed the folder, and thanked me for my trust, with a warmth I now understand was not performance at all, but something closer to satisfaction. The particular satisfaction of a woman watching a very old plan drawn out patiently over months finally begin to move exactly the way she had always intended it to. I signed away half my kingdom with a smile on my face, and I called it a celebration. 3 weeks before the wedding, something nearly killed me in my own kitchen, and it very nearly did its job. In complete silence, with nobody in the house to hear it happen. It was a Tuesday night late, the kind of hour when the whole house settles into that particular stillness that comes after everyone else has gone to bed. Kaylani had moved into her own apartment 2 years earlier, and I had grown used to those quiet nights alone, with the hum of the refrigerator and the tick of the clock my father left me, working through contracts at the kitchen island, the way I had done for 4 decades. I poured myself a cup of coffee black, the way I always drink it after 9 at night when I know sleep isn't coming easily regardless. I had taken my morning capsules with breakfast, same as every day for the past several weeks. I thought nothing of it. I had thought nothing of it every single morning since Dr. Combs first slid that amber bottle across my desk. I took 1 sip of the coffee, then another. Less than 5 minutes later, the room tilted sideways. It did not feel like indigestion or fatigue or any of the small betrayals a 68-year-old body offers up on a difficult week. It felt like someone had reached directly into my chest and closed a fist around my heart. The pain was total, immediate, radiating down my left arm with a heat that had no business belonging to something so cold and mechanical as pain. I gripped the edge of the counter. My knees buckled. The wooden spoon I had been holding. I carry it with me even into the kitchen at midnight. A habit so old I no longer notice myself doing it. Slipped from my fingers and clattered against the tile floor, spinning once before it went still. I went down after it. I remember the floor against my cheek, cold and hard. And I remember thinking with a clarity that still unsettles me that this was how it would end. Alone on a Tuesday. Nobody close enough to hear me fall. I could not draw a full breath. Every heartbeat felt like something tearing loose inside my chest. I stared at the wooden spoon lying an arm's length from my face, my grandfather's initials facing up toward the ceiling light. And I thought of my daughter, and I thought that I would not live to walk her down the aisle in 3 weeks. And something in me that has never once in 68 years allowed itself to feel truly helpless finally let go and felt it completely. And then, exactly as suddenly as it had arrived, the pain vanished. Not faded, vanished. One moment my chest was a collapsing building, and the next I was simply a man lying on his kitchen floor, breathing hard, heart hammering fast but steady, the crushing weight gone, as completely as if someone had reached in and switched it off. I lay there for a long time before I trusted my own legs enough to stand. The silence in that kitchen afterward was its own kind of unbearable. No ambulance, no panic. Just the refrigerator humming and the clock ticking and my own ragged breath slowing by degrees in a room that had nearly become the last place I ever stood. The overhead light buzzed faintly, the way it always did after midnight. A car passed somewhere out on the street, headlights sweeping briefly across the ceiling, gone again before I could make sense of it. I stayed on the floor and let the ordinary sounds of my own house put themselves back together around me, one small noise at a time. A real heart attack does not work that way. I know this the way I know my own name, because I sat beside my late wife's hospital bed for 11 days while doctors explained cardiac events to me in more detail than any grieving husband should ever have to absorb. A genuine cardiac event leaves damage. It leaves markers, tremors, and aftermath that lingers for hours or days, not something that simply switches off after 3 minutes, like a light someone forgot to turn on permanently. I sat on my kitchen floor a while longer, saying nothing, thinking nothing, letting the cold tile draw the last of the adrenaline out through my spine. There is a particular kind of quiet that follows a moment like that. No words for it, no thought worth finishing, just the sound of your own pulse and the specific texture of the silence in a house built for more people than currently live in it. When I finally stood, I did not reach for my phone. I did not call for help or call my doctor or call anyone at all. I looked instead at the amber bottle sitting on the counter beside the coffee maker, exactly where it sat every single morning, patient and unremarkable, dispensing 2 capsules a day, like clockwork, into a body it had been quietly rewriting from the inside for weeks. I had not changed my diet. I had not changed my exercise. I had not changed the coffee I drink most nights of my life. There was exactly one new variable in my entire existence over the past several weeks, and it was sitting 6 inches from my hand in a bottle a man I barely knew had personally delivered to my kitchen counter. I picked the bottle up slowly, turning it once in my hand, the way I might examine a contract clause I no longer trusted. And I felt something shift inside me that had nothing to do with my heart and everything to do with 40 years of surviving men who believed they had outsmarted me. I did not throw it away. Not yet. I smiled instead, cold and slow, and set the bottle back down exactly where it had been, facing exactly the same direction, as though nothing in the world had changed at all. From that night on, I became the best actor no one ever saw perform. I did not throw away the bottle that night, but I did not take another capsule from it either. The next morning, before the sun was fully up, I emptied all 30 remaining capsules into a plastic sandwich bag, sealed it, and hid it in the false bottom of my grandfather's old recipe box, the one that has sat on a shelf in my study for 30 years, holding nothing more dangerous than index cards written in his careful slanted hand. In its place, I filled the amber bottle with baking soda capsules I bought myself, purchased in cash from a pharmacy across town where nobody would recognize my face or think to mention my visit to anyone who might ask. I called Roger before breakfast and told him I needed something handled quietly, off the books. No paperwork, no explanation beyond what I was about to give him directly. He arrived at my house within 20 minutes, still in his church clothes from the early service, and he listened without interrupting while I told him everything the freezer scare had not happened yet, not for 3 more weeks, but the tremor Dr. Combs had diagnosed. The strange comfort Miles had shown in pushing me toward an unfamiliar physician, the way my chest had nearly stopped the night before, after nothing more dangerous than a cup of coffee. Roger's face went very still while I talked, the particular stillness I would come to recognize in the weeks that followed, as the look of a man calculating exactly how much danger someone he loves is standing inside of. "I need these tested," I told him, sliding the plastic bag across my kitchen counter, the same counter where I had nearly died less than 12 hours earlier. Somewhere with no connection to my name. No insurance billing, no paper trail, nothing that touches this family or this company. "I know a place," Roger said, and did not elaborate further, and I did not ask him to. 20 years of driving me through the parts of my life I preferred not to examine too closely had taught him exactly how much explanation a moment required. He told me only that it was a private laboratory on the outskirts of the city, the kind of facility that specialized in discretion rather than advertising. The kind of place a man with military connections might know about from a life lived before he ever drove a car for anyone. I did not ask how Roger knew such a place existed. Some men carry entire histories behind them like shadows, and Roger had earned over 3 decades of loyalty, the right to keep his in the dark where he'd left them. "They'll want payment in cash," he said, "and they'll want a week minimum for a full breakdown." A week. 18 days before the wedding, if I counted correctly, which left almost no margin at all between the results and the ceremony itself. "Do it anyway," I said. He left with the bag tucked into the inside pocket of his jacket, and I stood at my kitchen window and watched his truck pull out of my driveway, and something in my chest tightened that had nothing to do with whatever compound had nearly stopped my heart the night before. There is a particular kind of fear that comes from committing fully and irreversibly to distrusting people you have spent years loving. Once that package left Roger's hands, there was no version of the coming weeks where I could pretend, even to myself, that I had simply imagined the danger closing in around me. I spent the rest of that day rehearsing a performance I had never once in 68 years needed to give. At dinner that evening, when Kaylani called to ask how I was feeling, I let my voice carry a small, careful tremor. I told her the tremor in my hand had gotten slightly worse, that I'd felt unusually tired that afternoon. Nothing alarming, just the ordinary complaints of a man my age carrying too much stress into a wedding season. She fussed over me the way I knew she would, told Miles to remind me to take my supplements consistently, and I thanked her and told her I loved her, and hung up the phone feeling something close to shame at how easily the lie slid out of me. Miles called an hour later, his voice thick with manufactured concern, asking whether I'd been keeping up with the morning regimen, whether the fatigue had improved at all. I told him it had, slightly, and thanked him for connecting me with Dr. Combs, and I listened to the particular warmth in his voice, the genuine-sounding relief, and I understood with a clarity that still turns my stomach that I was now watching a man perform sincerity with the same skill I was performing decline. Two of us lying to each other across a phone line, both convinced the other had no idea. I did not sleep well that night, or the nights after it, but I made certain nobody watching me could tell the difference. I swallowed my baking soda capsules every morning with the same careful ritual I had always used, letting Kaylani watch me do it whenever she visited, letting Miles ask his careful, tender questions about how I was feeling. The package Roger carried out of my driveway that Sunday morning was already somewhere in a laboratory I would never see, undergoing tests I did not fully understand, and there was no way now to call it back. No version of the coming week where I could simply decide the danger wasn't real and return to the man I had been 3 weeks earlier. I had crossed a line I could not walk back across. And some part of me standing at that kitchen window understood exactly what that meant. The results came back 9 days later on a Thursday evening, delivered to Roger's phone through an encrypted file a technician at the laboratory refused to discuss over any line that wasn't secure. Roger drove straight to my house without calling ahead, and I met him at the door, already knowing from the particular set of his shoulders that whatever he carried was worse than either of us had allowed ourselves to imagine. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had nearly died 3 weeks earlier. The same table where Kaylani used to do her homework as a girl, and I read the toxicology report twice before I trusted myself to speak. I read it once quickly, the way you read something you already suspect will be bad, and then a second time, slowly, forcing myself to absorb every clinical sentence. The compound was not a supplement in any sense a reasonable person would recognize. It was a synthetic agent engineered to bind slowly and invisibly to arterial walls, accumulating over weeks without triggering any standard blood panel, sitting dormant in the body like a seed waiting for the right season. On its own, the report explained the compound was almost entirely inert. A man could carry it for months and feel nothing beyond the occasional tremor, the occasional wave of fatigue easily blamed on age or stress. But introduced to a very specific chemical trigger, a beverage with unusually high acidity and alcohol content, consumed after weeks of accumulation, the compound activated within minutes, constricting the coronary arteries with a violence that would read to any coroner as a sudden and entirely natural cardiac event. No trace, no evidence. A tragic, unremarkable death for a man of my age on a day already crowded with enough emotion to explain away almost anything. I set the report down on the table and thought immediately, with a clarity that turned my stomach, of a conversation I had nearly forgotten from 6 weeks earlier. Miles standing in my study with a wine catalog open on his tablet, insisting with unusual passion that we upgrade the reception's toast from the champagne I had already selected to a specific vintage brut he described as having, in his words, remarkable acidity and body. He had called it Kehlani's Dream Champagne. He had ordered 4 cases before I finished asking a single question about the price. I had thought at the time that I was simply witnessing a young man wanting to impress his new family with expensive taste. "He chose the poison himself," I said quietly, more to the report than to Roger. "6 weeks ago, in my own study, and I paid for it without asking a single question." Roger did not answer right away. He was staring at something else entirely, a second folder he had brought with him, thinner than the first, which he set down on the table beside the toxicology report with a kind of careful hesitation I had rarely seen from him in 20 years. "There's something else," he said. "Something I found while I was pulling background on Dr. Combs, trying to verify his credentials through the state medical board. It didn't lead anywhere useful on him, but it led me somewhere strange on Margaret." He opened the folder to a single printed page, an old phone log from the company's front office archived years ago and mostly forgotten. The kind of record nobody thinks to check because nobody ever thinks there is any reason to. Buried 3 boxes deep in a storage room none of us had visited since before Kehlani finished college. "This number called the company 3 separate times, going back almost 6 years, Roger said, tapping a 10-digit sequence circled twice in blue ink. "Always asking for you personally. Never left a name the front desk staff bothered writing down beyond client inquiry. The number was disconnected not long after, and I would have thought nothing of it except," he turned the page, "except it's the same number listed as an emergency contact on a background check Margaret Santana submitted to our vendor onboarding system 6 months ago. Except that background check says the number belongs to her sister. Margaret doesn't have a sister on record anywhere else, not in any database I've pulled, not in any filing I can find." I looked at the circled number for a long moment, something cold and unnamed moving through my chest that had nothing to do with the compound, still sitting dormant somewhere in my bloodstream. "What does that mean?" I asked, though some part of me, some old and buried part I did not yet have language for, already suspected the question was smaller than the truth waiting behind it. Roger shook his head slowly, rubbing the back of his neck the way he does whenever a problem refuses to sit still in his hands. "I don't know yet. Could be nothing. Could be a clerical error 6 years old. But it's the kind of loose thread that usually means somebody built a story on top of a real life and forgot to erase every piece of the life underneath it." Outside somewhere down the street, a dog barked twice and went quiet. Neither of us said anything else for a long moment. We simply sat there at my kitchen table, the toxicology report and the phone log lying side by side between us like 2 halves of a puzzle we could both feel the shape of, but not yet see completed. Something in the quiet between us said, without either of us needing to speak it aloud, that we had not yet found the bottom of what we were standing on top of. 1 week before the wedding, I watched a woman reach up to fix her hair, and something in my chest went so cold I had to set down the glass I was holding before it slipped from my hand. We were standing in the finishing warehouse for the final tasting walkthrough, Kehlani, Miles, Margaret, and I, circling a long steel prep table where our head chef had laid out sample plates for the reception menu. The late afternoon light came in slanted through the loading dock windows, catching the dust in the air the way it always does in that building around 5 o'clock, and Margaret was leaning over a tray of pulled pork, discussing plating with the kind of focused authority she brought to everything. A strand of silver hair fell loose across her face. She reached up without looking, tucked it behind her ear with 2 fingers, and in the same motion pulled a small silver hairpin from her jacket pocket and fixed it back into place. A quick, practiced gesture, the kind a person repeats so many thousands of times, it stops being a decision and becomes something closer to breathing. I had seen that exact gesture before. Not similar to it, not reminiscent of it. Identical down to the particular angle of the wrist, down to the way her elbow lifted slightly higher than it needed to. A habit I had watched for 6 years across 1,000 ordinary mornings in a kitchen that no longer exists in the shape I remember it. My late wife used to fix her hair exactly that way. My late wife did not do this. My first wife did. Louisa, the woman who left when Kehlani was 6 years old, and never once looked back, who I had spent 35 years training myself not to think about, except in the careful, managed way a person thinks about a wound that has scarred over but never entirely closed. I stood very still, the tasting fork frozen halfway to a plate of collard greens, and I made myself listen to Margaret's voice, the way I had not truly listened to it before, past the calm, professional cadence, down into the particular rhythm underneath it. The way she dropped the last word of a sentence like she didn't need anyone's permission to finish it. It was the same rhythm. I had heard it 1,000 times, half a lifetime ago, in a kitchen in a house I sold 20 years back. Hassan Kailani's voice, gentle, concerned. "You've gone somewhere else. Everything okay?" I forced my face back into the shape it needed to hold. "Just thinking about the seating chart," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I had any right to expect. 40 years of boardrooms finally earning their keep in the one room where I needed them most. I did not say anything else for the rest of the walkthrough. I nodded at the right moments, tasted the right dishes, offered the right compliments, while some old buried part of me stood very still and refused to move, afraid that if I let myself think the thought all the way through, my own legs might give out beneath me, the way they had that night on my kitchen floor. I left before the tasting officially ended, telling Kailani I had a headache, which was not entirely a lie. I drove home alone in the dark, the radio off, my hands steady on the wheel, in a way that felt like the last steady thing left in my body. I did not go to bed when I got there. I went to my kitchen and I stood in front of the stove for a long time without turning on any lights, and then, almost without deciding to, I began pulling ingredients down from the cabinets. The tomato base, the smoked paprika, the particular blend of peppers my grandfather never wrote down anywhere, but taught with his hands the way Louisa had once taught herself to make it exactly right, better than I ever managed back before she left, and I told everyone, including myself, that I had forgotten how much she'd loved standing at that stove. I cooked the original family recipe from memory at midnight, alone, my hands moving through motions I had not consciously performed in over 3 decades, and somewhere in the middle of it, stirring a pot that smelled exactly the way my childhood kitchen used to smell, I said her name out loud for the first time in 35 years. Louisa. It sounded strange in my own mouth. Foreign and familiar at once, the way a language sounds when you haven't spoken it since childhood, but your tongue somehow still remembers the shape of it. I did not call Kailani that night to tell her what I suspected. I told myself it was because I had no proof, nothing beyond a hairpin and a rhythm of speech and an old ache I could not fully trust to be objective. That was true, but it was not the whole truth. The whole truth was that some part of me was not yet ready to hand this particular grief to my daughter. Not until I understood the shape of it myself, not until I knew whether the woman standing in my company's boardroom was truly her mother or simply a stranger wearing a gesture I had loved once and never quite managed to stop missing. I turned off the stove sometime after 2 in the morning and stood alone in my kitchen with a pot of sauce I had no intention of ever serving to anyone, tasting on my tongue something that was not quite grief and not quite hope, but some old and complicated third thing that I did not yet have a name for. I did not hear the front door open. I heard the particular creak of the third stair, the one that has announced every visitor to this house for 40 years. And by the time I turned around, my sister Natalie was already standing in the kitchen doorway, in her housecoat, her reading glasses still pushed up into her hair, studying me with an expression that held no surprise at all. "Kailani called me," she said before I could ask how she'd gotten in. "Said you left the tasting with a headache and weren't answering your phone. I still have my key." She glanced at the stove, at the pot I had not yet washed, at the faint smell of smoked paprika still hanging in the air at 2 in the morning. "You only cook Daddy's original recipe when something's gotten into you that you don't know how to say out loud." Natalie is 71 years old, 3 years my senior, and she has known me longer than anyone left alive on this earth. She helped raise Kailani in the years after Louisa left, showing up at my house most Sunday afternoons with a pot of black-eyed peas and rice, sitting at that same oak table while I worked through the particular grief of a man raising a 6-year-old alone, never once asking me questions I wasn't ready to answer. Kailani still calls those Sunday dinners her favorite memory of growing up. Still makes the same recipe herself now, and has no idea her aunt spent half of those afternoons quietly holding a household together that was closer to falling apart than either of us ever let her see. I did not answer her question either, not directly. I turned back to the stove, mostly so I would not have to watch her face while I said it. "I think I saw Louisa tonight," I said, "wearing a different name." I expected shock. I expected Natalie to drop into a chair, or press a hand to her chest, or ask me a dozen frantic questions about what I meant. Instead, the kitchen went very quiet, and when I finally turned to look at her, my sister's face had gone still in a way I recognized instantly, because it was the exact stillness I imagine had settled over my own face an hour earlier in that tasting room. "How long have you known?" I asked her. Natalie was quiet for a long moment, pulling out a chair at the table and sitting down slowly, the way a person sits when they've been carrying something heavy long enough that setting it down feels almost as hard as carrying it did. "I wasn't sure," she said finally. "Not certain sure, but I met your Margaret Santana at the engagement dinner back in the spring, and something about the shape of her face bothered me all night. I told myself I was being an old woman looking for ghosts in every stranger who reminded me of somebody I'd rather forget. Louisa's been gone 35 years, Hassan. People don't just come back." "But you kept thinking about it." "I kept thinking about it," she admitted. "I looked her up online once, out of nothing but guilt for even suspecting it. Couldn't find a single photograph from before 6 years ago. Not one. A woman that accomplished, that well-connected, and there's not a single picture of her existing before a certain point? No college yearbook, no old work profile, nothing. I told myself that was just how careful private people manage their online presence these days. I told myself a lot of things. "Why didn't you say anything to me?" Natalie looked at me for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a tiredness I had rarely heard from her in 71 years of watching her hold this family together. "Because you buried that woman the day she left," she said. "Not literally, but you closed a door in yourself so completely that I watched you become a different man in the space of about 6 months. Harder, more careful, better at business and worse at letting anyone close enough to hurt you again. I built my whole relationship with you these 35 years around never being the one to open that door back up. I told myself I was protecting you. Maybe I was really just protecting myself from watching you break a second time." I sat down across from her, the pot of sauce cooling on the stove behind me, and for a long moment neither of us said anything at all. There was a particular kind of silence that exists only between people who have loved each other long enough to know exactly which questions will cost the most to ask. "I need to know for certain," I said finally. "Not a feeling. Not a hairpin in an old habit. Proof." Natalie reached across the table and took my hand the way she used to when I was a boy, and she was already even then the steadier one between us. "Then we find proof," she said, "together this time, not you carrying it alone in some dark kitchen at 2 in the morning, while the rest of us go on pretending we don't see what's standing right in front of us." I asked her quietly why she hadn't said anything sooner, why she'd waited all these months until I finally brought it to her first instead of the other way around. She was quiet for a moment before she answered, her thumb moving once gently across the back of my hand. "Because it's been long enough to be scared that saying it out loud would break everything you've spent 35 years trying to rebuild." 3 days before the wedding, I sat in Stanley Portillo's office long after the rest of the building had gone dark, waiting for a man named Hayes Cole to tell me exactly how deep the ground beneath my family actually went. Stanley had brought him in quietly off the company's books, entirely a private investigator he'd used twice before on matters too delicate for our regular security firm. Hayes was 52 years old, built like a man who had spent decades being underestimated, with the particular stillness of someone who has learned that most people reveal themselves faster in silence than under direct questioning. He shook my hand once firmly and did not offer any small talk about the weather or the wedding 2 days away, which I appreciated more than I expected to. He arrived carrying a single accordion folder thick with red pencil annotations and set it on Stanley's desk without any of the ceremony Margaret would have brought to the same gesture. I need everything, I told him. Miles first, then Margaret Santana. I don't care how it looks when it's finished. I need to know exactly what I'm standing on. Hayes opened the folder to its first section and slid a printed summary across the desk. Your future son-in-law has a problem, he said matter-of-fact, the way a mechanic describes a failing transmission. 2 years ago, he moved $400,000 out of a client trust account belonging to a widow in Overland Park. The client recently hired her own forensic accountant to review the estate ahead of a move into assisted living. That accountant flagged irregularities 11 days ago. My contact at the State Bar Association tells me an ethics complaint is already sitting in an intake queue waiting on formal review. I had suspected something of this shape since the loose thread Roger pulled 2 weeks earlier, since the growing weight of everything I had chosen to notice and file away rather than confront directly. Hearing it confirmed on paper in a stranger's clean typewritten summary still landed like a blow to the chest. He's not a killer by nature, Hayes added, almost as an aside, sliding a second page across. I've done this work a long time, Mr. Rosario. I can usually tell the difference between a man who enjoys what he's doing and a man who's drowning and grabbed the nearest thing that would keep him afloat. Your Miles is the second kind. Doesn't make what's coming his way any less deserved, just means the story's a little more complicated than a simple villain. I did not know at the time how much that single observation would matter to me later. Hayes turned to the second section of the folder, and I felt Stanley go very still beside me. The particular stillness of a man who had already read this part once, and was bracing himself to watch me read it for the first time. Margaret Santana doesn't exist before 6 years ago, Hayes said. Not as a licensed consultant, not as a registered business owner, not in any professional directory I can find. What I did find, working backward through a disconnected phone number your driver flagged for me, is a woman named Luisa Moreno, divorced from a Hassan Rosario in Jackson County court records 35 years ago. No criminal history, no fraud convictions, nothing that would show up on a standard background check because she never broke a law. Until now. He slid a third document across the desk. A certified copy of a divorce decree, my own signature faded but legible at the bottom of it, a name I had not seen written out in full in over 3 decades. The phone number matches, he continued. The timeline matches. And this is the part that took me the longest to find, because whoever structured it buried it well. He pulled a final page from the folder, a financial routing document dense with clause numbers and account references I recognized instantly from the $85 million contract sitting in my own safe. Section 12. The majority control provision your general counsel flagged during signing. The account designated to receive the transferred equity isn't registered to the distributor at all. It's a holding entity registered 8 months ago in Missouri, under a name I traced back through 2 shell layers to Luisa Moreno directly. I sat with that for a long moment, the office silent except for the hum of the building's after-hours ventilation system and the faint sound of Stanley's mechanical pencil tapping once, then going still, as though even he had run out of careful objections to raise. She wrote the clause herself, I said slowly. She didn't just help Miles plan this, she built the exact mechanism that would deliver my company into her own hands. That's how it reads, Hayes said. And there's one more thing if you want it. Might not mean much to a man in your position, but I've done this work long enough to notice when it does. He tapped the divorce decree once. The settlement 35 years ago left her with almost nothing. No stake in the company, no formula rights, not even a mention in the original trademark filing, even though half the archived recipe notes in your own family records are written in 2 different handwritings. I stared at the routing document at the shell entity carrying a dead name back to life and understood for the first time with total clarity that I was not simply facing a woman who wanted my money. She wasn't just stealing from me. She believed she was finally taking back what I had erased. 24 hours before the tasting ceremony, I built a trap out of the one thing Miles and Luisa had never bothered to steal from me, the recipe itself, and everyone who had ever helped me protect it. We gathered in my study a little after midnight, the same room where Miles had once slid a wine catalog across my desk and talked me into ordering my own poison. The same room where I had signed the venue amendment that sealed us all inside this property in the first place. Stanley arrived first, 2 junior attorneys trailing behind him with laptops and a portable printer, already talking through the structure of what we needed before he'd fully taken off his coat. Natalie came next, still in the same housecoat from 2 nights earlier, carrying a thermos of coffee strong enough to keep the whole room awake until sunrise. The last person through my door was Fernando Frank. I had not spoken to him directly in nearly 2 months, not since the morning Miles first mentioned Dr. Combs over coffee in this very study. I had told myself over and over that I would call Fernando eventually, once the wedding chaos settled, and I had let that lie sit comfortably enough that I nearly missed how much it had cost me, a friendship of 25 years, allowed to go quiet out of nothing more than convenience and a stranger's better bedside manner. He stood in my doorway for a moment before crossing the room, his old physician's bag in one hand, his expression somewhere between hurt and relief. "Roger called me 2 hours ago," he said. "Told me you needed a doctor you actually trust. Didn't need to hear much more than that." I crossed the room and shook his hand, and then, because 25 years of friendship deserved more than a handshake, I pulled him into an embrace instead, feeling the old man's shoulders go tense with surprise before relaxing into it. "I should have called you the moment Miles suggested Combs," I told him. "I let a stranger's confidence outweigh 25 years of yours." "I'm sorry, Fernando." "You were protecting your daughter's happiness," he said, stepping back, his eyes suspiciously bright. "I've forgiven worse from better reasons. Now show me what's actually in your bloodstream, because Roger wasn't specific and I don't like surprises in my own patients." While Fernando began reviewing the toxicology report at my desk, the rest of us turned to the harder work of the night. Stanley's team had spent the previous 2 days quietly reconstructing an exact replica of the $85 million distribution contract. Identical formatting, identical letterhead, identical routing language in every clause except one, Section 12. The majority control provision Louisa had buried so carefully now pointed to a fully isolated shell account we controlled completely, disconnected from any real banking system, built to look to anyone checking from the outside, exactly like the account Louisa believed she had already secured months earlier. "The moment she or Miles triggers the transfer clause," Stanley explained, spreading both contracts across my desk side by side, "this decoy activates instead of the real one. It'll show a successful transfer on their end, full confirmation, routing numbers, everything a person checking quickly would expect to see. But the money never actually moves anywhere. It stays exactly where your real trust has already been relocated, a new entity Stanley's team finished securing 2 nights ago, buried under enough legal protection that not even a coordinated audit could reach it before Monday." Natalie leaned over the 2 contracts, comparing them line by line with the same careful attention she used to bring to reviewing my father's old recipe notes. "They're identical," she said, sounding almost impressed despite herself. "I wouldn't know the difference." "Neither will she," Stanley said, "until the moment it matters." I looked around that room, Stanley's exhausted legal team still typing, Natalie pouring coffee for anyone whose cup had gone empty, Fernando cross-referencing the toxicology report against a stack of medical journals he'd brought from home, Roger standing quiet guard by the door the way he had for 20 years, and felt something shift in my chest that had nothing to do with fear. I had spent 3 weeks carrying this alone, certain that strength meant handling every threat by myself. The same instinct that had built an entire company out of a single rented warehouse and cost me somewhere along the way the ability to let anyone close enough to help carry the weight of anything that truly mattered. I was not carrying it alone anymore. Fernando finished his review a little after 3 in the morning and looked up from the report, his expression grave in a way I had rarely seen from him. "I can build a neutralizing agent," he said. "It exists theoretically for exactly this kind of synthetic compound, but I won't pretend the injection itself is gentle. It's going to hurt Hassan badly for a few minutes, and I need you completely certain before I put a needle anywhere near you." I did not hesitate, though some old careful part of me registered exactly how much I was now trusting other people with the outcome of this plan. "Build it," I said. I've survived worse than pain for less important reasons. By the time the sun came up over the finishing warehouse, the decoy contract sat ready in Stanley's briefcase, indistinguishable from the real one to anyone who did not already know exactly where to look. And I stood at my study window watching the first delivery trucks arrive for the ceremony, feeling for the first time in 3 weeks something that almost resembled readiness. Hayes Cole called me at 4 in the morning while Stanley's team was still finalizing signature formatting on the decoy contract, and told me he had something I needed to hear before the sun came up. He had placed a monitoring flag on the burner phone traffic connected to the number Roger first found buried in our old call logs, a standard surveillance technique he explained for numbers already tied to an active investigation, something he'd set up quietly 2 days earlier, without mentioning it, the kind of precaution a careful investigator takes without waiting for permission. At 1:17 that morning, that number had placed an outgoing call to a Kansas City attorney neither of us recognized, a man named Del Ashworth, who specialized, according to his public bar listing, in white-collar defense and voluntary disclosure agreements. Hayes played the recording for me over the phone, his voice flat and professional, the way a man delivers evidence he has learned not to editorialize. Miles's voice came through first tight and fast, the particular rhythm of a man talking himself toward a decision he was terrified to make out loud. "I need to understand my exposure," Miles said. "If I came forward voluntarily. Before anything happens, full disclosure, full cooperation, whatever it takes to keep this from becoming worse than it already is." The attorney's voice was calm, measured the tone of a man who has had this exact conversation with 100 frightened clients before. Voluntary disclosure carries significant weight with prosecutors, especially if no actual harm has occurred yet. If you're describing a plan that hasn't been executed, walking away now puts you in an entirely different legal position than executing it and hoping nobody notices. "And if I've already taken steps," Miles asked, his voice dropping lower, "but nothing's actually happened yet? Nobody's actually been hurt?" "Then you have a window," Ashworth said. "A narrow one, but it closes the moment any part of the plan executes, whether the harm succeeds or not." There was a long pause on the recording, long enough that I found myself holding my own breath on the other end of Hayes's phone call, some old and unwanted part of me almost hoping the boy would find his way back from the edge he'd been standing on for 10 months. Then a new voice entered the recording, sharp and sudden, close enough to the phone that Hayes told me later she must have been standing in the same room the entire time listening. "Louisa." "Hang up the phone, Miles." Miles's voice cracked with panic. "Margaret, I heard exactly what you were doing." Her voice carried none of the warmth I remembered from 35 years ago, none of the calm professionalism I'd watched her use in my own boardroom. This was something colder, older, a version of her I had never once met, even during our marriage. "You do understand that a voluntary disclosure names me specifically. Every account, every clause I structured, every dollar routed through entities I built. You walk into that lawyer's office, you don't just save yourself. You hand me to the federal government wrapped in a bow." "I can't do this anymore," Miles said, and for the first time in the entire recording, he sounded less like a calculating criminal and more like a frightened young man drowning in a decision he'd made too desperate to survive it cleanly. "I never wanted anyone to actually get hurt. This was supposed to just be money." "It was always going to require more than money," Louisa said. "You knew that from the very first conversation. If you back out now, I go to the widow's forensic accountant myself, anonymously, with everything I know about the $400,000 you moved out of her trust account 2 years ago. You will lose your license, your freedom, and Kaylani in that order within a single month. Or you finish what we started, and in 3 days you have more money than you will ever need to make any of it disappear." The recording went quiet after that. Hayes told me Miles hung up without another word, and that the call log showed no further outgoing contact with Ashworth's office in the hours since. I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment after the recording ended, staring out my study window at the gray light just beginning to touch the horizon. The same window I'd stood at only hours earlier, watching delivery trucks arrive for a ceremony none of the men driving them understood the true weight of. I had spent 3 weeks building a case against a monster. What Hayes had just handed me instead was the sound of a frightened young man trying at the very last possible hour to climb out of a hole he dug himself into. And a woman who had once been my wife closing that hole over his head with the same cold precision she was using to close it over mine. He tried, I said quietly, mostly to myself. He tried, Hayes agreed. Doesn't change what happens next, just changes how you might feel about it once it's over. I thanked Hayes, ended the call, and sat alone in my study for a long time before I trusted myself to walk back into the room where the rest of my family was still waiting. Still building the last careful pieces of a trap I now understood was closing around two very different kinds of people. One who had chosen this path with open eyes, and one who had simply never been given a way out of it. 1 hour before the tasting ceremony, I sat shirtless on the edge of my own bed while Fernando Frank prepared a syringe I had spent 3 weeks hoping I would never actually need. The neutralizing agent sat in a small glass vial, pale blue, thick enough that I watched it move slowly when Fernando tilted it toward the light to check for particulates one final time. He had been awake for nearly 24 straight hours by that point, and his hands, when he finally reached for the syringe, were steadier than I had any right to expect from a man his age running on nothing but coffee and adrenaline. "I won't lie to you," he said, swabbing my shoulder with a cold alcohol wipe. "This is going to hurt. The compound has to move fast enough to coat the arterial pathways before that champagne ever reaches your bloodstream, which means I'm delivering a concentration higher than anything I'd ever prescribe under normal circumstances. You're going to feel it burn. Your heart rate is going to spike before it settles. If you want to back out, this is the moment." "I've buried a wife," I told him. "I've built a company out of a rented warehouse with 11 employees and a used delivery truck. I am not backing out of a needle, Fernando." He nodded, once the particular nod of a man who has stopped trying to talk a patient out of a decision already made, and pressed the needle in. The burn arrived almost immediately. A thick, spreading heat that had nothing in common with the sharp, familiar sting of an ordinary injection. It moved up through my shoulder and across my chest like something alive, and for a moment, my vision narrowed at the edges, my ears filling with a high, distant ringing that made Fernando's voice sound like it was traveling to me through water. My heart slammed hard against my ribs, once, twice, a rhythm too fast and too violent to be anything close to comfortable, and I gripped the edge of the mattress with both hands, riding it out the way I had once ridden out board meetings I was certain would end my career. It lasted perhaps 90 seconds. It felt considerably longer. Slowly, the burning receded into a dull, heavy ache, and my heartbeat began settling back into something recognizable. Fernando watched me carefully, 2 fingers pressed against my wrist, counting. "Steady," he said, finally releasing a breath I hadn't realized he'd been holding alongside me. "You're going to feel that ache in your shoulder for hours, maybe into tomorrow, but the coating should hold. If the toxicology report is accurate about the trigger mechanism, you should survive contact with the champagne." He packed his bag slowly, methodically, the way he always had, and paused at the door. "I'll be in the second row during the ceremony, close enough to reach you in under 10 seconds if anything goes wrong. Just in case the coating isn't as perfect as I'm telling myself it is." I stood testing my own legs and reached for my shirt with hands that were only shaking slightly now. And I told myself the tremor was the injection and nothing else, even though some quieter part of me already suspected it wasn't. My phone rang before I finished buttoning my collar. Hayes Cole's voice was different than it had been at 4 that morning. Faster, sharper, carrying an urgency I hadn't heard from him in 3 days of measured professional reporting. "I need you to hear this before you walk out that door," he said. "I picked up something new overnight, off a cloud backup Margaret's Luis's assistant synced, without realizing it was still linked to a shared family account. A draft press release, time-stamped 2 hours ago. Tell me," I said, my hand going still on the last button. "It's not just about the money anymore, Hassan. The draft is written for release the moment the contract's second signature clears. Same trigger as the transfer clause, timed almost exactly together. It's an exclusive interview pitch to 3 different local outlets, positioning her as the birth mother of Kehlani Rosario, wrongfully erased from her daughter's life by a controlling, wealthy ex-husband. It frames the whole thing as a redemption story. Long-lost mother finally reunited, finally recognized right as she becomes a majority stakeholder in the family company, through what she's calling a, quote, long overdue restoration of what was always rightfully hers. I stood very still in the middle of my own bedroom, my shirt half buttoned, the ache in my shoulder suddenly feeling very small against the weight of what Hayes had just told me. She's not planning to disappear with the money, I said slowly, understanding arriving in pieces, each one heavier than the last. She's planning to stay, publicly, as Kehlani's mother, with my company's ownership as the proof that she was wronged and finally made whole. That's how it reads, Hayes said. She's not running Hassan, she's staging a homecoming. I thought of Kehlani somewhere down the hall, in her own dressing room, having her hair pinned into place by a stylist who had no idea what the morning actually held. I thought of 35 years of silence of a woman I had told my daughter more times than I could count had simply chosen to leave and never come back, and of how differently my daughter might one day hear that same story, told from a stranger's podium, framed as rescue instead of ruin. Louisa didn't just want my money anymore. She wanted the world to know she was still Kehlani's mother, and she planned to announce it before I ever got the chance. 220 guests rose to their feet when the string quartet shifted into the processional, and I walked out into the Kansas City sunlight toward the ceremony arch we had built in the shadow of my own loading docks, carrying my grandfather's wooden spoon in one hand and 40 years of carefully rehearsed calm in the other. I found my seat in the front row beside Natalie, who squeezed my hand once hard before letting go. Roger stood near the perimeter fencing in his usual position, dressed for the occasion but positioned exactly where a man watches for trouble, rather than where a man watches a wedding. Fernando sat 2 rows back, close enough to reach me quickly, his old physician's bag tucked discreetly beneath his chair. Stanley sat with his briefcase resting against his leg, the decoy contract inside it close enough to touch. Harrison Faulkner, the distributor's chief executive, sat near the front with the rest of the honored guests, a glass of water in his hand instead of champagne, exactly as he always carried himself at business functions, dressed up as celebrations. Kehlani walked down the aisle on my arm, radiant in a way that made my chest ache with a grief I had not yet allowed myself to feel fully, because feeling it now would have broken the composure I needed for another 20 minutes. The ceremony itself passed the way these things do, vows, rings, and officiant's blessing, spoken warmly over 220 guests who had no idea they were witnessing the opening act of something far larger than a marriage. I said nothing. I smiled when smiling was expected. I walked my daughter to the altar and placed her hand in the hand of a man I now knew with total certainty had spent 10 months planning my death. My shoulders still ached beneath my tuxedo jacket, a dull, steady reminder of exactly how far I had already gone to survive the next 20 minutes. And I held that ache close like ballast while Miles spoke his vows with a sincerity so convincing I nearly hated him more for the performance than for the plot itself. When the vows concluded, the officiant turned to address the tasting ceremony itself, a tradition specific to our family, one my grandfather had started decades ago, in which the patriarch offers a blessing over the reception's signature sauce before it is served to the assembled guests, a small ritual meant to bind the old recipe to the new family being formed. Before we proceed to the tasting, the officiant said, his voice carrying easily across the warehouse courtyard, tradition holds that if anyone present believes this union should not proceed, or carries knowledge that bears on the sanctity of what we celebrate here today, they may speak now before the blessing is given. It was meant to be ceremonial, a formality nobody expected anyone to actually use. 3 seconds of respectful silence before moving on to the toast. I set my grandfather's wooden spoon down on the ceremonial table beside the untouched jars of sauce, the same table where in a few minutes Margaret Santana had planned to insert an encrypted drive and drain my company's fortune while I collapsed from a poisoned toast. I stood. Kaylani turned toward me first, her expression shifting from confusion to alarm in the space of a single heartbeat. "Dad," she whispered, "what are you doing?" I did not answer her directly. I walked to the small podium the officiant had been using, reached for the microphone with a steadiness that surprised even me, and turned to face 220 of Kansas City's finest competitors, board members, old friends, distant relatives, and one distributor's CEO holding a glass of water instead of champagne. "I have something to say," I said, and my voice, amplified across that courtyard, carried none of the tremor I had spent 3 weeks performing for the benefit of exactly the man now standing frozen at the altar behind me. A ripple of confused murmurs moved through the crowd. Somewhere behind me, I heard Harrison Faulkner set his water glass down slowly, deliberately, the sound of a careful man deciding this was a moment worth his full attention. Miles's easy, practiced smile fractured at the edges, replaced by something tighter, something closer to fear, though he was still working hard to keep it from reaching his eyes. 3 days ago, I continued, I learned that the distribution contract several of you are here today to witness signed contains a hidden provision, one designed to transfer majority control of my company into the hands of someone who has spent the last 6 months embedded in my business under a false identity. The murmurs sharpened into gasps. Somewhere near the back, a chair scraped hard against the concrete. Miles took a single step toward me, his hand raised as though he could physically stop the words already spoken. "Hassan, whatever you think you know—" "I know exactly what I know, Miles," I said, my eyes finding his across the courtyard, steady and merciless in a way I had never once allowed myself to be with him before. "I know because I was standing in a freezer 6 hours ago listening to you and your accomplice plan the exact minute my heart was supposed to stop." The courtyard went utterly, completely silent. 220 faces stared at me frozen between disbelief and dawning horror, and at the altar behind me, I watched every trace of color drain from Miles Carrillo's face, his eyes darting once involuntarily toward the shadow of the oak tree at the edge of the courtyard, where I already knew exactly who he was looking for. Miles found his voice before Margaret found her courage, and what came out of him was not an apology. "You don't understand what you've done," he said, his composure cracking into something wild and desperate, loud enough now that his voice carried past the microphone and across the entire courtyard without any amplification at all. "The transfer clause already executed. Hassan, the second signature cleared the moment the officiant pronounced us married. It's done. Whatever you think you're accomplishing up there, you're already bankrupt. You're standing in front of 200 people announcing your own company's collapse." A fresh wave of gasps rolled through the crowd. I watched several board members exchange stricken glances, already calculating losses that existed only in Miles's imagination. Harrison Faulkner leaned forward in his seat, his water glass forgotten entirely now, watching me with the sharp, assessing stillness of a man who has sat through 100 corporate disasters and recognizes instantly that this one is different. I let the silence stretch for exactly as long as I needed it to, feeling for the first time all morning something close to calm settle into my chest, alongside the dull ache still radiating from my shoulder. "You're right that the clause executed," I said finally, my voice steady, almost gentle, the voice I use when I already know I've won and want the other party to understand it slowly, completely, without a single word wasted. "You're wrong about what it transferred." Miles's face shifted, confusion cutting briefly through the panic. "Section 12 was rewritten 4 days ago," I continued, "by my general counsel working from a template your own accomplice was foolish enough to draft in a format we could replicate exactly. The contract you triggered this morning is not the contract sitting in my company's safe. It's a decoy structured to look identical to the real one in every routing detail that matters until the money actually tries to move. Whatever you and Louisa believe just transferred into your account has moved precisely nowhere. It's sitting in a fully isolated shell entity my legal team built specifically to catch it. I paused, letting that land, watching understanding move slowly across 220 faces at once, the particular silence of a crowd realizing simultaneously that they are witnessing something they will describe to other people for the rest of their lives. There is no $85 million for you to inherit, Miles. There never was, not from the moment my team finished building the decoy. You didn't steal my company this morning. You confessed to a federal crime in front of 200 witnesses and a company distributor's chief executive. Miles staggered backward half a step, one hand reaching for the altar behind him, as though his legs had genuinely stopped working. Stanley rose quietly from his seat in the front row, unlatched his briefcase, and held the real contract aloft for the crowd to see, its cover identical to the decoy in every visible way, except for the small, deliberate watermark his team had embedded in the corner, invisible except under direct light. Nobody in that courtyard needed a law degree to understand what they were looking at. A man had just publicly confessed to a crime that had already failed. But that's not the part of this morning I actually need you to understand, I said, turning slightly now to include the full crowd in what came next, my voice hardening into something I had not allowed myself to feel fully until this exact moment. 3 weeks ago, I nearly died in my own kitchen. My heart stopped functioning correctly for almost 3 full minutes, and I did not understand why until a private laboratory confirmed what I am about to tell all of you. I looked directly at Miles. The daily supplements you personally arranged for me to take, the ones my daughter watched me swallow every single morning, believing she was watching her father take care of his health, contain a synthetic compound engineered to build silently in my arteries for weeks before activating on contact with a specific trigger: high acidity, high alcohol content. Precisely the profile of the champagne you personally selected 6 weeks ago and insisted we serve at today's reception. The gasps turned into something closer to screaming, several guests rising from their seats entirely. I heard somewhere behind me Kaylani make a sound I had never heard my daughter make before. Something between a sob and a question that had no words attached to it yet. "You didn't just try to steal my company, Miles," I said, my voice carrying clean and merciless across the sudden chaos. "You spent 2 months poisoning me in front of my own daughter, and you planned to let her watch me collapse during our toast, believing to her dying day that her father simply died of a broken, overworked heart?" Behind me, I heard Kaylani's voice finally break through her own shock, thin and disbelieving. "Miles, tell him it isn't true. Tell him." He did not answer her. He could not, I think, find any version of an answer that would survive contact with the 220 faces now watching him fail to produce one. Miles's eyes swept the crowd wildly now, searching for an exit that did not exist, searching for Margaret near the oak tree, and finding only the empty space where she had been standing moments earlier. He had nowhere left to run, and some visible animal part of him had only just begun to understand it, his hands opening and closing at his sides, as though searching for something solid to hold on to in a world that had just stopped making any sense at all. I turned from Miles to find Margaret standing again near the edge of the courtyard, having reappeared from wherever she'd retreated to during the chaos, her professional composure visibly fraying at the edges for the first time in 6 months of watching her wear it flawlessly. For one brief moment, I considered pulling my daughter aside, finishing this conversation somewhere private, sparing her the specific cruelty of learning the truth about her mother in front of 200 witnesses instead of in the quiet of my own study. I looked at Kaylani's face, tear-streaked, and searching mine for some explanation that would make the last 3 minutes make sense, and I understood with total clarity that a private version of this truth would only give Louisa room to shape the story afterward, to soften it, to find some private moment alone with my daughter where the woman who had raised her could be recast as simply a victim of circumstance. Kaylani deserved every piece of this truth, delivered exactly as ugly as it actually was witnessed by enough people that no one could later rewrite it into something gentler than the reality. I chose to finish it here, in the light, in front of everyone. "There's one more thing," I said, and this time my voice was not hard, not triumphant, but something closer to grief dressed up as steadiness. The woman standing by that tree is not who she told you she was, Kaylani. Her name isn't Margaret Santana, it's Luisa Moreno. The name meant nothing to most of the crowd. It meant everything to my daughter. Kaylani's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, disbelief, and then something that broke my heart worse than anything that had happened all morning, a dawning, desperate hope. The specific hope of a woman who has spent 23 years quietly wondering about the mother she barely remembered. 6 years old and confused, watching a suitcase disappear out the front door and never coming back. "That's not possible," Kaylani whispered, though her eyes were already moving toward Luisa with an intensity that told me some part of her already suspected the truth before I finished saying it. "My mother is dead. You told me she was dead." I had told her that. I had told her that lie for 23 years, believing it kinder than the truth that Luisa had simply chosen to leave. And standing there in front of the entire courtyard, I understood that this particular lie was mine to answer for, separate from everything Luisa and Miles had done. "I told you that because I couldn't find a way to explain why your mother left without you thinking it was something you had done," I said, and for the first time all morning, my own voice cracked. "I'm sorry, Kaylani. I was wrong to let you believe a lie for so long, even a lie I told to protect you." Luisa had gone very still by the oak tree, watching her daughter's face with an expression I recognized instantly because I had seen it once before, 23 years ago, on the morning she packed a single suitcase and told me she couldn't stay in a house that had stopped feeling like her own life. "Luisa," I said, turning to face her directly, "tell her yourself. Tell her the truth for once in this entire plan and let it be the one honest thing you give her." For one long, suspended moment, standing in the sun with 200 people holding their breath around us, I thought she might actually do it. I thought for that single, fragile second that I might get to watch some small piece of the woman I had once loved choose honesty over survival. Instead, her hand moved toward the tablet she still carried, the same sleek device she had used throughout the engagement to coordinate vendors and manage logistics. And I watched her fingers move rapidly across the screen with the desperate speed of a woman trying to salvage something, anything, from a plan that had already collapsed around her. "Ma'am, step away from the device," one of Stanley's security consultants called out, moving toward her from the perimeter. But Luisa had already entered whatever command she was attempting, her thumb pressing down hard on the screen with a finality that suggested she believed even now that some part of this could still be saved. The security monitor mounted discreetly near the catering tent, the one Roger had installed weeks earlier and never once mentioned to anyone outside our small circle, flared suddenly bright red, a piercing alert tone cutting across the courtyard, loud enough to startle even the guests still too stunned to have moved from their seats. "Fraudulent access attempt detected. Unauthorized transfer logged. Source identified." Luisa stared at her own tablet screen, her face draining of every ounce of the composure she had worn flawlessly for 6 months, as she understood in real time exactly what she had just done in front of a security system built specifically to catch her doing it. She had tried in her final desperate act to steal something that no longer existed to steal, and in doing so, she had handed my legal team the one piece of evidence I had not been entirely certain I would get. Proof captured, live and unambiguous, of her own hand at the center of the entire crime. The courtyard around us had become something closer to chaos. Guests rising, security moving, Kaylani sobbing openly now beside me. And somewhere beneath all of it, Luisa Moreno stood frozen by an oak tree, staring at a screen that had just ended whatever version of this plan she had believed until 30 seconds ago still had a chance of surviving. Miles broke first. He turned from the altar and ran not toward Luisa, not toward any explanation he might have still believed could save him, but toward the loading dock gate at the far edge of the courtyard, his tuxedo jacket flying open behind him, moving with the desperate, graceless speed of a man whose body had finally caught up to what his mind had understood minutes earlier. He did not get far. Roger moved before I even finished processing that Miles had bolted, closing the distance across that courtyard with a speed that belonged to a much younger man, and he brought Miles down hard onto the gravel path a dozen yards short of the gate, both of them skidding across loose stone in a tangle of tuxedo fabric and grunted breath. Two of Stanley's security consultants reached them seconds later, pinning Miles face down while Roger knelt on his shoulders, breathing hard, his expression carved from the same granite stillness I had watched him wear in a much darker room 6 hours earlier. Miles stopped struggling almost immediately, going limp against the gravel in a way that looked less like surrender and more like a man finally setting down a weight he had been carrying for far too long to keep pretending it was light. I watched something shift across his face as Roger hauled him upright, hands secured behind his back with a zip tie one of the security consultants produced from a jacket pocket. Not defiance, not the calculated composure he'd worn for 3 years in my boardroom, but something closer to relief, brief and involuntary, quickly buried beneath a wave of visible despair. It was the same expression I would understand only later, of a man who had spent one desperate hour at 4 a.m. trying to find his own way out of this exact ending, and had finally, in the worst possible way, arrived at it anyway. Louisa did not run. She stood perfectly still by the oak tree as the same security team moved toward her, her tablet still clutched in one hand, her eyes fixed not on the approaching guards, but on her daughter standing frozen 20 feet away in a wedding dress that suddenly looked less like a celebration and more like a costume from a play that had gone catastrophically wrong. "Kehlani, Louisa," said, her voice cracking for the first time all morning, the careful, professional cadence finally abandoning her completely. "I need you to know that I never wanted—" "Don't," Kehlani said. One word flat and final, cutting through whatever sentence Louisa had been building. "Don't you dare finish that." The security team reached Louisa, and she did not resist them, simply let her hands be secured. Her eyes never once leaving her daughter's face, as though she were trying to memorize it before it was taken from her a second time. Somewhere behind her, I noticed Natalie standing very still, one hand pressed to her own mouth, watching the woman she had spent 23 years quietly protecting me from, finally standing exposed in the open Kansas City sun. I turned toward Kehlani, my own composure finally beginning to fracture now that the immediate danger had passed. Now that there was nothing left to perform, no more careful tremor to hide, no more strength I needed to fake for anyone's benefit but hers. She was staring at the space where Miles had been standing, at the space where Louisa had been standing, her wedding dress catching the sun in a way that felt, in that moment, almost cruel. All that careful white silk, all that hope, standing in the wreckage of the two biggest lies of her entire life, delivered within minutes of each other. Her knees buckled before I reached her. She did not scream. She did not sob. Not at first. She simply folded slowly, gracelessly, her hand reaching for nothing in particular as her legs gave out beneath the weight of her own wedding dress, and I closed the last few yards between us at a speed I did not know my 68-year-old body still possessed. My shoulders screaming from the injection, my heart pounding in a rhythm that had nothing to do with any poison and everything to do with watching my only child collapse in front of 220 witnesses to the worst morning of her life. I caught her before she hit the ground, my knees hitting the gravel hard enough to tear through the fabric of my own tuxedo trousers, though I did not feel it. Not then. Her whole body shook against me, silent at first, and then breaking into the kind of sobbing that comes from somewhere far deeper than grief alone. A sound I recognized distantly as the sound of every certainty a person has ever held about their own life collapsing at once. She pressed her face into my chest, her hands gripping the front of my tuxedo jacket with a desperation I had not felt from her since she was small enough for me to carry, and around us, the courtyard dissolved into chaos. Guests scattering, security barking commands somewhere in the distance, the first faint wail of approaching sirens finally beginning to cut through the Kansas City morning. I held my daughter on the ground where her wedding was supposed to have been, and I understood with a clarity that felt almost unbearable that nothing I had done that morning, not the honeypot, not the injection, not the entire careful architecture of my revenge, had actually protected her from anything at all. It had only ensured she would survive long enough to feel every piece of it. Natalie reached us before anyone else did. She dropped to her knees on the gravel beside me without a single word, gathering the loose folds of Kaylani's wedding dress in both hands, the way she used to gather a blanket around a much smaller child on cold Sunday mornings, and she wrapped one arm around both of us at once, pulling us into a shape that felt for just a moment like the only stable thing left standing in that entire courtyard. Kaylani did not lift her head. She stayed pressed against my chest, her whole body shaking with a grief too large to have a single name, and Natalie pressed her lips briefly against the crown of my daughter's head, murmuring something I could not quite hear over the sound of Kaylani's own breathing. Roger appeared a moment later, kneeling close enough to shield us from the worst of the chaos still unfolding across the courtyard. Miles being walked toward a waiting security vehicle, Louisa following a few yards behind under separate guard. 220 guests scattering in every direction, some toward their cars, some simply standing frozen in place, unable to look away from the wreckage of what they had come to celebrate. Somewhere in the middle of all of it, one of Stanley's junior attorneys quietly retrieved my grandfather's wooden spoon from the ceremonial table where I had set it down and pressed it gently into my free hand without a word, as though he understood better than I could have explained to him myself that I would need it close. I held my daughter and I held the spoon, and for a long stretch of time I did not speak at all. The sirens grew louder, then closer. Then arrived Kansas City patrol cars pulling through the front gate, officers moving through the scattered crowd with the particular calm efficiency of people who have learned to enter chaos without becoming part of it. Someone draped a blanket over Kaylani's shoulders. Someone else asked me gently whether I needed medical attention myself, and I shook my head without any real words to offer in response. Because every word I owned had already been spent on that podium, and what remained in me now had nothing to do with speech at all. I felt the ache in my shoulder where Fernando's needle had gone in hours earlier. I felt the sharper sting where gravel had torn through my trouser fabric and into my knee. I felt the particular exhaustion of a body that had been running on adrenaline and fear for 3 straight weeks, finally understanding all at once that the danger had passed and it was allowed to stop. My hands, when I finally looked down at them, were shaking in a way that had nothing to do with any performance at all. The first honest tremor I had allowed myself since the night I first found the amber bottle sitting innocently on my own kitchen counter. Kaylani's crying slowed by degrees, the way a storm eventually exhausts itself, not because the grief underneath it had lessened, but because a body can only sustain that much feeling for so long, before it needs, however briefly, to simply breathe. She did not speak. Neither did I. Neither did Natalie, whose hand had not once left my daughter's back, whose own eyes were wet in a way she made no effort to hide from either of us. The Kansas City sun kept moving overhead, indifferent and warm. The same sun that had watched 220 guests arrive that morning, expecting nothing more complicated than a wedding. Somewhere beyond the courtyard fence, the sounds of the ordinary world continued without pause. A delivery truck idling, a bird calling from somewhere in the oak tree Louisa had stood beneath, the distant hum of Kansas City traffic, entirely unaware that anything unusual had happened here at all. A stray gust of wind moved through the abandoned reception tables behind us, rattling a stack of untouched champagne flutes together in a soft, hollow chime. And somewhere beneath the settling dust, I caught the faint, ordinary smell of hickory smoke still drifting over from the smoker pit, indifferent to everything that had just happened 30 yards away. I do not know how long the 3 of us stayed like that on the gravel, tangled together, in a shape that had nothing to do with the ceremony we had all shown up for, and everything to do with the family that had actually survived it. Long enough that the courtyard mostly emptied around us. Long enough that Roger eventually stood and quietly began coordinating with the officers on our behalf, giving us the only gift he had left to give, time and enough space to fall apart without an audience. I looked down at the wooden spoon still resting in my hand, my grandfather's initials worn smooth by 4 generations of fingers exactly like mine. And I traced my thumb once across the familiar grain of it, the same motion I had made 1,000 mornings before this one, though nothing about the weight of it in my palm felt familiar anymore. I understood holding my broken daughter against my chest in the wreckage of everything I had built to protect her, that some truths cost you long after you've already won. I had recognized that voice the moment I heard it through a crack in a freezer door. I understood now, kneeling in the gravel with my daughter's tears soaking through my ruined tuxedo shirt, that recognizing a truth and being ready to survive it were never in fact the same thing at all. 6 months later, in a glass-walled boardroom overlooking the Kansas City skyline, my grandfather's wooden spoon sits on the corner of Kaylani's desk, the initials worn even smoother now by a second set of fingers, learning where mine left off. In the top drawer, unopened, a single envelope rests in careful, familiar handwriting. Some mornings she touches the spoon before she touches anything else. Some mornings she doesn't touch the envelope at all. I spent 40 years believing that control was the same thing as love, that if I built the walls high enough, checked every contract twice, tested every stranger who came near my daughter, I could keep the people I loved from ever being taken from me again. I was wrong. Louisa taught me that lesson twice, 23 years apart, once by leaving and once by coming back. Control never actually kept anyone safe. It only kept me lonely enough that I nearly missed a son-in-law's smile hiding a weapon, and a mother's grief hiding a wound neither of us had ever let heal. What truly protects the people you love isn't a fortress built alone. It's the people willing to stand in the gap beside you. I have prayed more since that morning than in the 20 years before it combined. I thanked God for a driver whose hand knew exactly when to cover my mouth. I thanked God for a sister who kept a spare key and a heavier truth for 23 quiet years waiting for me to be ready to carry it. And most nights now before I sleep, I still ask God for whatever mercy Louisa has left coming to her. Because a broken woman doesn't stop being somebody's child just because of what she chose to do with her pain. If you were me, if you learned in one single morning that the man marrying your daughter and the mother you'd told her was dead were both standing in front of you with a knife behind their backs, would you expose it all in front of 200 witnesses the way I did? Or would you find a gentler room, a smaller audience, a softer way to break your daughter's heart? Tell me down in the comments which one you'd choose. Protect your bloodline, keep your eyes open, and I'll see you in the next story.